Our next session will be on approach to refractory GERD. I request chairpersons Dr. Rajesh Badashia, Dr. Sukumar Borat, and Dr. Deepak Shah to come up on the stage. Dr. Rajesh Badashia, Dr. Sukumar Borat, and Dr. Deepak Shah. I request Speaker Dr. Pratik Poddar, Consultant Gastroenterologist, to come up on this dais.
Thank you so much for giving me this session here. And unfortunately, gastroenterologists will block everything. We had fatty liver, MASLD, and we are discussing GERD. So we end up with nothing to eat ultimately. So we'll talk about GERD when the classification is symptoms of heartburn or complications because of refluxate of gastric contents in the esophagus. And note that also the oral cavity as well as the lungs, which can be a problem. This is an iceberg phenomenon. So the number we see all over the country and all over the world actually belies what we actually have. It's a huge number of patients who don't end up in the clinic and they have symptoms all over. So India is actually in the high prevalence zone for GERD. And if you look at the data from all over the country, almost 15 to 20% of the population actually has GERD symptoms. And the patients, or more than 10% of GERD in India actually have erosive esophagitis, especially in the older population. Now we have the typical, atypical and the alarm symptoms, and the focus here is on the alarm symptoms, because whenever we have alarm symptoms like dysphagia, odynophagia, dysphonia, cough, bleeding, weight loss, anorexia, anemia, you may actually be dealing with something more sinister. So there are images of strictures, there are images of malignancy, and you can have these issues in these patients. So if you look at what is refractory GERD, because this is a huge topic, we'll cover the crux of the matter, which is refractory GERD, and patients keep coming back to us with symptoms of heartburn, and we don't know what to do, what is to be done with them. So the standard definition is that 8 weeks of a standard PPI regimen, and then the patient fails. This is when we call it GERD, which is refractory to therapy. Now if you look at the breakup of this GERD, 80%, 70% would be non-erosive disease. So the endoscopy will appear absolutely okay. 30% would be erosive, and you'll have a 10%, 5% population which is Barrett's. Of course, the data is much lower in India. And if you look at the patients who are not responding, you'll find a huge number of patients, almost 50% of the NERD, not responding to therapy. And this is refractory GERD and 10% of actually erosive esophagitis. So this number of patients, what can be done? So my talk will cover especially the points which are important. The first thing that we ask when we deal with refractory GERD, is it actually GERD? Are we dealing with that? Are we looking at the lifestyle clearly? Are we using the adequate drugs which are there completely, properly, adequately? What are the newer drugs that we can use? And is there a role of surgical or endoscopic therapy in our patients of refractory GERD? So when we ask the first question, is it GERD? Well, there are two parts of it. One is actually refractory GERD, and the other is actually refractory symptoms. The patient does not have actually reflux disease. The symptoms are there which are refractory. And here, functional chest pain, functional heartburn, motility disorders are the ones which can be a problem, and these are the ones which we need to look at. Eosinophilic esophagitis, impaired gastric emptying, and extraesophageal symptoms are actually refractory symptoms. They are not GERD per se. And we need to make this dichotomy and difference by proper investigation before we label it as refractory GERD. Now, this is important to understand that when we have an incomplete response to PPI therapy, now let's not look at the left and right sides, look at this side only, which is the right side. If the patient is having incomplete response, and the patient should undergo a proper diagnostic evaluation. So it includes a good, proper upper GI endoscopy, a pH impedance metry, and a high resolution manometry. So the pH impedance is basically simple. A catheter is placed in the throat, in the esophagus. It measures 24 hours or even 72 hours of pH that the acid is actually refluxating into the food pipe. And of course, the manometry will give us the pressure which is changing in the food pipe. If the patient actually has esophagitis, so we have a classification for it, anything which is B, C, D, so higher grades of esophagitis, that is refractory GERD. And if you look at the others, the patient actually may be having functional heartburn, or they can be only reflux hypersensitivity, which may actually be labeled as GERD, but is not GERD. So these diagnostic 3 tests may actually help us differentiate the two. The only difference in the two sides is, if the patient does not have proven GERD, then you need to give the tests of PPIs, especially the pH test. And if the patient is actually having known GERD, then you can do the test on PPI, and this can help us diagnose this disease. So this is an interesting case I got in my clinic. A 52-year-old female, dyspepsia, reflux, heartburn, and chest pain for the past 6 months. She'd been using PPI, even domperidone combinations, double dosing of that, but not much benefit. There's nocturnal aggravation. Endoscopy was done twice outside. The alias was competent according to the report. Antral gastritis. She was put on amitriptyline. She was put on multiple drugs, prokinetics. Nothing worked. On the detailed history, when she came to me, there was some swallowing difficulty. The history was very unclear. I did a manometry for the patient, and this is the tracing of the manometry. You can see in this tracing, there is absolutely no peristaltic movement in this patient. This patient had achalasia cardia. Now, very early achalasia cardia mimics GERD symptoms very closely. In fact, the data shows in all GERD refractory to therapy, 1% will be achalasia cardia, and we may not miss this. So this triple test, so you have the pH impedance, where a small catheter is placed and the patient eats their food. They have a small transducer, they press the button, and the patient will let us know when they're having reflux. And we look at the actual reflux symptoms with the actual reflux catheter in the food pipe. This is the manometry system which we use for pressure, and this is the endoscopy showing different grades of damage to the esophagus because of acid, A, B, C, and D. And this is very important because anything B and above is actually proper esophageal damage. So whenever we have refractory GERD, this is how we proceed. The first thing is to talk about the lifestyle measures, and I'll discuss that, but the lifestyle measures should be the first approach to refractory GERD. Second is to optimize the anti-secretory therapy, which is PPIs. We can use twice a day. The timing is important, we'll discuss that, and we have newer drugs. We can also use adjunctive newer agents, topical agents, special measures like diaphragmatic breathing, and ultimately, if all else fails, even surgery and anti-reflux endoscopic therapy should be considered in these patients, in the right patient. So what about lifestyle? According to data, almost 2/3 of patients have no idea about lifestyle interventions. Only 1/4 were actually spoken about lifestyle interventions by the practitioners. Now we talk about food. Some people say avoid citrus food, some say avoid spicy food. The data is very mixed. Till date, food has not been established as a trigger. If there are certain trigger foods for a patient, they can stop those trigger foods. But there is no blanket order on foods as to avoid spicy, oily, or anything, any other food like that. The gap between eating and lying down is very important. So 2.5 and 3 hours is the recommendation. And elevation of the head of the bed and left lateral positioning is also very important. We need to understand the data currently shows even left lateral positioning of the patient is almost equivalent to raising the head on the bed. And a lot of people say, sir, can I use 2 pillows, 3 pillows? Remember, using extra pillows actually bends the patient forward, increases reflux. It has to be a horizontal elevation from the waist up. So it is basically a wedge mattress they have to use, not extra pillows. Smoking has been found to increase the reflux episodes, and cessation improves twofold improvement in the patient of symptoms. And alcohol also has been found to increase the reflux, but some studies are showing those who are taking more alcohol actually have suppression of symptoms. So the data for alcohol is very mixed. Important thing is weight loss. There is literally a dose-response relationship between BMI and patients' refractory GERD symptoms. Reduction of BMI by only 3.5% has been shown to reduce 40% of GERD symptoms in these patients. So if you look at the lifestyle measures on the left, these are definite by data. Left lateral positioning, weight loss, smoking cessation, the gap between the meal, and basically head and elevation. But all the food data is basically mixed, and there is no clear-cut answer with anything to avoid anything. Now, important to conform to adherence, we always understand that PPI has to be taken. But how many of the patients take PPI on the right time? The data shows that the response with the patients take PPI post-meal, not just 30-60 minutes before a meal, they take just before a meal, or they take even later before lunch, the response to PPI is very poor. So the best response is taken in the first meal of the day. Adherence should be confirmed. 30 to 60 minutes should be the gap between the PPI and the meal. And you can go up to twice daily also. And this is the most important thing to understand. Also, people ask me very frequently, which PPI should we use? Well, the potency data is already there. Esomeprazole, dexlansoprazole, and ariprazole have been found to be more potent compared to omeprazole, and pantoprazole has been found to be lower potency. So this is the data. The most important thing is, there is something called CYP2C19 polymorphism. So we are basically, in this hall right now, there are people who metabolize this PPI better, there are people who metabolize this PPI worse, and there are people who are metabolizing normally. This data in India also is showing, and this data is from the cardiological data, almost 15 to 20% of people actually are fast metabolizers of PPIs. For them, standard dose of PPI will not work. For them, you have to use a PPI which bypasses its metabolism, or you have to use a double dose or maybe a higher dose of PPI, or a different drug altogether. And this is very important for those patients who do not respond. Now, nocturnal acid breakthrough is also very problematic for PPI users, because this part of the time where there are newer proton pumps being formed, they are not basically covering the nocturnal acid reflux, and that is always a problem. Sucralfate has been used since time immemorial. The data is very limited in GERD, especially only for pregnant females, also for antacids. The problem with antacids is the patient will get a benefit at the same time, but then there will be a rebound hyperacidity, and the patient will actually have worsening of symptoms later on in some cases. What about prokinetics? You see all of our patients conforming to domperidone-based regimens. So this D, that D, XYZ D, they are taking it twice a day, thrice a day. Does it actually work? So the data shows that adding of prokinetics has no significant benefit in the healing of esophagitis. What it does is, it will only improve the symptoms a bit. So adding of prokinetics is actually a very niche that we should look at, not as a blanket order for everybody. There is of course now vonoprazan in the market where people are using this. Now vonoprazan definitely has meal independency. It is stable in the acid. It is also very more effective in decreasing the acid secretion. So patient nocturnal acid breakthrough is actually suppressed better. So in these cases, in all the patients of GERD, if you look at reflux, non-erosive reflux as well as PPI resistant group, there is benefit of giving vonoprazan based therapy in these patients. Of course, there are other trade-offs, but we are discussing GERD at the moment. I was very honored to be part of the consensus group, and we published this in JAPI. And we had the consensus guideline on vonoprazan use in refractory GERD, where through a Delphi consensus, we told that yes, vonoprazan is superior to PPI for higher damage and higher grades of GERD, LA grade C and D, and we can use vonoprazan for these patients effectively. We have alginates also, which are basically seaweed polysaccharides, which form a raft, and they prevent a physical barrier, and the physical barrier prevents the acid from going up. The advantage it also prevents any bile reflux, any non-acid reflux from happening, so it can be used as on-demand therapy, and you can see a raft forming on the contents of the stomach, and the patient gets relief. What about surgery and fundoplication? Well, we are always very apprehensive of using surgery as a therapy, and patients are also very apprehensive. Importantly, we must understand that surgery is indicated for severe esophagitis, patients who are non-compliant with the PPIs, who don't want to continue PPIs, and I get so many patients who say, so what about the kidney damage? What about long-term problems? So for them, surgery is always a good option. They have a large hiatus hernia, there is enough volume regurgitation, and of course, if they have complications, surgery remains the best option. So there we do fundoplication. And importantly, long-term improvement is there, and it is sometimes in selected patients. So the important thing here is selected patients. It is as effective as medical therapy for these patients. There is something called the LINX device therapy. So basically, there are metallic beads which have titanium coating, and you implant them along the LES surgically. And this forms a new sphincter, which helps make the sphincter more competent. We have something called the TIF. So this is basically an endoscopic fundoplication which we can do, and this can also prevent the reflux from happening, and it's actually quite effective for patients who do not have large hiatus hernias and have troublesome symptoms who want to stop therapy. The problem with fundoplication, 10 to 15% will have insufficient relief. There can be some complications, and also there is a mortality risk. So this is always there. New symptoms almost in 2/3 of the patients, like gas bloat syndrome, dysphagia, and reoperation in almost 10%. So this is a problem because they might have to go for a reoperation. And ultimately, if you look at the data, if you are giving the surgery long enough time, 30 to 40%, almost 50% will ultimately restart the PPI over long term. So this is a problem, but even with that, for certain group of patients, fundoplication remains the best option for long-term improvement. So two-pay fundoplication has been found recently in a review article to be the best, but of course it is the surgical's prerogative. They need to decide which surgery they are more comfortable with their patients. So these are a few pictures. This is the TIF procedure where you are actually doing an endoscopic fundoplication. This is the mucosectomy. So we basically cut a portion of the fundus, it becomes fibrosed and it forms a neosphincter. This is the LINX device, magnetic, basically a chain of links around the esophagus and causes a sphincter. And this is very interesting, it is called the STETA device, radiofrequency ablation. So you do a radiofrequency ablation of the esophagus, which makes the sphincter tighter, and the patient actually has reduction in reflux symptoms. So to last two slides, we talk about the flow of GERD. So if there's any risk factors, any alarm symptoms, you go for endoscopy. If the patient does not have any risk factors and the PPI therapy has persistent symptoms, we use double dose therapy, we may use vonoprazan, but then we may have to go for endoscopy, manometry and pH impedance testing. If there is acid reflux, we think of optimizing the acid suppression. If there is no acid reflux, we can consider functional dyspepsia and functional heartburn as our diagnosis. So to take home, we must first reassess the diagnosis. Subtle red flags require stepwise investigation. A good endoscopy makes a big difference. Lifestyle has 4 L's: left lateral positioning, leave smoking, no late dinners, and get lean. Optimize the PPI therapy before declaring it a failure. You can think of switching to vonoprazan for patients who have a failure. Certain patients do require alginates. Prokinetics is very dicey, and other drugs can be used in certain patients. And for the right patient and the right candidate, surgery is actually a very good option depending on long-term improvement. For me, I would say, for the young people who actually do not want to take therapy for life, large hiatus hernia, surgery remains a very good option for them. So let's put this fire out of GERD together. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Poddar, for covering such a big subject in such a small time. I have just one question. So how did you manage that patient which you encountered and diagnosed their achalasia?
So achalasia cardia, right now we have options available. We have options of POEM as well. This is basically a per oral endoscopic myotomy where the sphincter is cut by an endoscopic surgical procedure. We can do a surgical myotomy, and of course we have a balloon dilatation. So we gave the options to the patient. The patient chose to do a balloon first, and if the patient failed, they would rather go in for a surgical procedure later on. But the patient responded very well. The patient is on follow-up for the past month, and they are doing very well. So we do something called the Eckardt scoring before the balloon dilatation and after dilatation. So the Eckardt scoring showed a phenomenal response, and the patient is doing very well now.
Second question, vonoprazan was indicated in cases of erosive esophagitis. It came in the market as a treatment for erosive esophagitis. So now are you using it in non-erosive esophagitis also, which is refractory to therapy?
See, this is a very controversial question in general because it's a very controversial topic. Because vonoprazan, though effective, has its own trade-offs. You are using a drug which is a more potent acid suppressant. So we look at PPIs, always in the back of our mind, when the patient is going to the ICU, to the hospital, there's a risk of secondary infections, GI infections, there's a risk of hypergastrinemia, carcinoid tumors and other problems, NETs. Now with vonoprazan, the longer term data is not available from India. We have 10-year data from Japan, but there is no long-term data from the Indian population. And we know very clearly from the morning we have been listening to so many talks that every drug is different for the Western population, for the Mongoloid population and for the Indians as well. So we have seen with multiple drugs. So I think until more data is available with our country, we should use the drug cautiously and judiciously. We should not use it as a blanket for any RD. You can use it as add-on therapy, but like I mentioned, please use when there is objective evidence of reflux damage. Because the patient may be having something else. We saw a manometry case where the patient is having achalasia, and the patient unfortunately was on vonoprazan, not responding. So we have to be very careful.
So if there are no more questions, we are running short of time. I
Sir,
think we'll
please.
close the session.
Yes.
In case of Barrett's esophagus, or if there is some stricture in esophagus, should we use vonoprazan 10 milligram for life?
Sir, for life is a difficult question. There is no data yet for life. So right now the longest data is for 10 years from Japan. They have not seen any additional risk of malignancy, of any other infection. But please, we have to realize that the hygiene levels and the infection levels in Japan are much different from India. Now, when we talk about Barrett's or we talk about stricturing, we need to understand what is the background. If the patient actually is having a hiatus hernia, which is large, the patient needs surgery. And you will find the patient does not require PPI therapy for long. Because I myself have 3 patients of vonoprazan-induced nephropathy in this short duration. But the point is, it may be just an idiosyncratic reaction, and the data is very limited on this. So before we can recommend for life, we have to be very careful. But I tell my patients, if you have complications of peptic strictures or Barrett's, you have to choose. Either you go for surgery and you may leave the medication for life, or you have to be on the medication for life. Any medication, PPI or even vonoprazan maybe.
Thank you.
So we close the session if there are no more questions. Thank you.
I request Dr. Esar Baheti to felicitate Dr. Rajesh Padashia and Dr. Deepak Shah. We have already felicitated Dr. Pratik Poddar and Dr. Sukumar Borat beforehand. Pratik? Hey. We are very sorry, we have arranged felicitation for Dr. Pratik Poddar in Hall B. Next session. We will be introduced to a new molecule in this session, surmounting obesity with tirzepatide. I request chairpersons Dr. Emil Bhansali and Dr. Selina A. Starenia to come up on the stage. Dr. Emil Bhansali. Now I request Speaker Dr. Sujoy Ghosh, Consultant Endocrinologist, Monipal Hospitals, Dhakuria, to grace the dais.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today we have with us none other than Professor Sujoy Ghosh, sir, for the deliberation. Sir doesn't need any introduction. Just that recently, sir has been elected as the President of Endocrine Society of India. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. So without wasting much time, let me try and talk about tirzepatide, the new molecule. My job is relatively easy because we had several talks on obesity about an hour ago, and this is just an extension of what we have already heard. So first of all, a disclaimer that this is a sponsored talk by Eli Lilly. Now, the previous sessions where you heard about incretin-based therapies, whether oral or injectable, they were all GLP-1 based therapies. And the molecule that I'm going to talk about is both a GLP-1 as well as a glucagon GIP peptide agonist. Now, when both of these are taken together, that is GIP and GLP, there is an additive effect in terms of reduction in appetite and calorie intake, and there is reduced craving for food. The GIP has certain specific effects which the GLP-1 does not have, particularly at the level of the adipocyte, wherein lipolysis, intra-adipocyte fat trafficking is altered, as a result of which fat metabolism is increased, fat redistribution occurs, and possibly that is one of the reasons why it might have even greater benefit in terms of an anti-obesity drug. And there is predominant loss in fat mass rather than lean mass. Now, the entire set of programs, that is the studies that have been conducted with tirzepatide, have the mnemonic SURMOUNT, and I'm going to talk to you about this entire SURMOUNT program. To give you a brief overview, SURMOUNT 1 is the first of the studies, which essentially looks at weight management in people who do not have diabetes. Remember, a small proportion of people in SURMOUNT 1 did have pre-diabetes, and the results of that is, though exploratory in the sense, did show prevention of progression of pre-diabetes to diabetes. SURMOUNT 2 is a study in which you're looking at people with type 2 diabetes, where you're looking at weight management. Dr. J.J. Mukherjee clearly mentioned also that all of these drugs, when you use them in people with diabetes versus without diabetes, the ones who have diabetes, they have less weight loss compared to those without diabetes. Surmount 3 is a situation where you're looking at a group of people who already had intensive lifestyle measures. Dr. Mukherjee was trying to tell you what is the weight loss after considering what has happened in the placebo group. So if you look at Surmount 3, you will know that you've put in all of the so-called non-pharmacological therapies and then given the drug. What impact does it have? Surmount 4 is a weight maintenance trial. That is, you have a run-in period where you have a group of people who have been given the drug, and then in one group you stop the drug and in the other group you continue the drug to see what happens to the weight that was lost, how much of that do you regain, and what happens to the group that continued to take the drug. And Surmount 5 is an open label trial which directly compares semaglutide injectable versus tirzepatide in terms of weight loss. So coming to the first study, that is Surmount 1. I told you this is an RCT comparing people getting 3 arms of tirzepatide, that is one group getting 5 milligrams, the second group getting 10 milligrams, and the third group getting 15 milligrams of injectable tirzepatide subcutaneously once weekly compared to the placebo group. There's more than 2,500 individuals at about 120 sites, and what we can see is over a period of time, the placebo group lost only about 2.4% of weight, whereas, as you can see, with the 5 milligram dose of tirzepatide, there was a 16% weight loss at about 72 weeks. That is about a year and a half. And if you look at the other 2 doses, that is 10 and 15 milligram, the weight loss was above 20%. Now, obviously, everybody is not going to have the same kind of weight loss. So, one of the things that was discussed is any drug to be called a weight loss drug, you have to lose at least 5%. So, if you look at what proportion lost 5%, you can see almost everybody lost 5% weight, irrespective of the dose of tirzepatide. If you're looking at more than 10% weight loss, at least 75% of the patient lost 10% of weight, and at least 50% lost more than 15%, and about 30% lost more than 20% with the 5 milligram dose of tirzepatide. So if you're looking at what proportion lost more than 10%, so 9 out of 10 would have lost more than 10%, and 3 out of 4 would have lost 10% of weight. That is pretty significant. Now, what proportion lost more than 50%? You can see that at least 20% weight loss happened in more than 50% of the patients with the tirzepatide, which is again pretty dramatic. So 8 out of 10 patients with 15 milligram of tirzepatide lost more than 15%, and 2 out of 3 lost more than 20% with the tirzepatide 15 milligram dose. Now, when you're losing weight, one of the things that you have to be aware is, what is your body composed of? Your body is composed of water, bones, your gut, organs, intestine, muscle and fat. What you essentially want to lose is fat, and you don't want to lose muscles. And in all of the anti-obesity trials, you can see that the weight loss that has happened, about 80% of that is fat loss, and about 15 to 20% is muscle loss. Now, part of that could be intramuscular fat loss as well, because the DEXA scans that we use cannot differentiate between the decrease in the muscle volume versus the intramuscular fat loss. But predominant weight loss is the fat loss. And one of the things that we will all have to learn, and we will all listen in the years to come, will be drugs that will preserve muscle mass and resistance exercises and training exercises through which we can maintain muscle mass when we are using such anti-obesity drug. So as ancillary cardiometabolic benefits, you see in these studies that there is a significant reduction in blood pressure, close to about 8 millimeters of mercury in systolic, 5 millimeters of mercury diastolic, dramatic improvement in the triglyceride levels and LDL cholesterol levels. Now coming to the second study, which is actually SURMOUNT-5 in this particular slide deck, all of us are interested and all of us keep comparing apples with oranges. I think it's unfair to do it, but somehow Lilly decided to do a study comparing semaglutide with tirzepatide. Remember, the only hitch in this study is this is an open label study. So people knew who was using what. So that's one of the limitations. Nevertheless, people had this kind of a up-titration regime, and the maximally tolerated dose was offered to both groups. This is a phase 3B, multi-center, randomized, parallel arm, open label, active comparator control study. And what you see at the end of 1.5 years is, at the end of 1.5 years, the weight loss with semaglutide was about 15%, and the weight loss with tirzepatide was above 20%. So significant difference in weight loss of about 5% when you're using tirzepatide as compared to semaglutide. And if you're looking at the proportion of people who achieved at least 25% reduction in body weight, 1 in 3 patients on tirzepatide lost at least 25%, whereas only 1 in 5 individuals lost 25% when you use injectable semaglutide. So if your weight loss is your primary reason why you're using the drug, probably tirzepatide scores over semaglutide. And you essentially want to lose fat from the wrong areas, right? You want to lose belly fat. You want to lose visceral fat. So as you can see here, the waist circumference change is almost about 20 centimeters with the tirzepatide or Mounjaro. One of the things that you can remember is every percentage weight loss that you have will lead to that number of centimeters of waist circumference reduction. So 10% weight loss will be 10 centimeter waist circumference reduction. 20% weight loss will be about 20 centimeter weight loss, waist circumference reduction. So what happens when you discontinue tirzepatide? So this is from the SURMOUNT-4 study. So here you see for the first period, that is up to week 36, people were up titrated to tirzepatide either to 10 or 15 milligrams, whatever they tolerated best. And then there was a period when they were randomized. One group continued the tirzepatide and the other group was then switched over to a placebo. And at 88 weeks, you are now trying to see what has happened to these individuals. So, not surprisingly, in the placebo group where you had stopped the drug, the weight regain was there. And the regain was close to about 10%. So, initial period there was a 20% weight loss at 36 weeks, and about half of that weight loss was regained if you stopped the drug. But if you continued the drug, there was again a further sustained 6% weight loss at 88 weeks. What about adverse events that we are talking about? Because all of these drugs will have some problem or the other. And the major problem is essentially GI side effects. So nausea, diarrhea, constipation, all that was discussed with semaglutide is also there. And this is in the SURMOUNT-1. All of the GI side effects is similar to all of the previous GLP-1 studies. Now, is there any difference in side effect between tirzepatide versus semaglutide? So this is from the SURMOUNT-5. You can see that the GI side effects are almost similar in both of these groups of people. SURMOUNT-4, where you actually had a continuation phase with placebo. Obviously, in the placebo phase, the side effects came down and the GI side effects continued in those who continued with the active drug. So if you summarize, tirzepatide significantly reduces body weight by an average about 16% with the 5 milligram dose and above 20% with the 15 milligram dose. Tirzepatide in the SURMOUNT-5 study demonstrated superiority over the semaglutide. Again, remember it was an open label trial, and it improved key cardiometabolic parameters including blood pressure, waist circumference, triglyceride, HDL cholesterol. And the most common adverse reactions were gastrointestinal, which were mostly mild to moderate, and it happened mostly every time you up-titrated the dose and was transient. I shall stop there, and before I finish, I would invite all of you to join us at the National Conference of the Endocrine Society of India beginning of next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sujay Ghosh, for such a nice and extensive deliberation on tirzepatide, which is latest molecule as an anti-obesity drug. My question is that are there side effects, GI side effects somewhat different between semaglutide and tirzepatide?
It's almost the same.
Almost same. Only theoretical. Only theoretical that GLP, GIP is both
See,
agonist.
we have now data from the SURMOUNT-5, which have looked at the GI side effects, which is identical in both the groups.
Otherwise, no difference in side effects. So this session is open for any question and comment.
Thank you.
I request Dr. Kaushik Chaki to felicitate Dr. Sujoy Ghosh and Dr. Selima S. Tadenia. We have already felicitated Dr. Emil Bhansali beforehand. Thank you all.